The morning sun cast long shadows across the Williams ranch as Martha stepped onto her weathered front porch, her calloused hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee. At 63, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every step mattered when you were alone. The small ranch stretched before her, modest but well-tended, with neat rows of vegetables and a sturdy barn that her late husband Thomas had built with his own hands 15 years ago. Rex lifted his graying muzzle from where he lay beside the porch steps, his dark eyes tracking Martha's movements with quiet devotion. The German shepherd's coat showed more silver than black these days, and his once proud ears drooped slightly with age, but he never strayed far from Martha's side. To anyone passing by, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, an old farm dog content to spend his remaining years sleeping in the sun and following his mistress around the property. Martha scratched behind Rex's ears as she surveyed her small domain. The mortgage had been paid off years ago, and Thomas had left her enough to get by, though money grew tighter each month. Still, this land was hers, bought and paid for with honest work and sacrifice. The deed sat safely in Thomas's old desk, along with the modest savings they had managed to put aside during their marriage. She walked toward the vegetable garden, Rex padding silently beside her, his movements still fluid despite his apparent age. The tomatoes needed tending, and the corn was coming along nicely. It was honest work, the kind that made a person tired in a good way. Martha had always found peace in the rhythm of farm life, the predictable cycle of planting and harvest that connected her to something larger than herself. As she knelt among the tomato plants, Martha noticed Rex's ears perk up slightly, his head turning toward the eastern horizon. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing except the rolling hills that stretched toward town. After a moment, Rex settled back down, though something in his posture remained alert. Martha thought nothing of it, returning to her work while the old dog seemed to doze in the morning warmth. The sound of her own humming mixed with the gentle breeze that rustled through the cottonwood trees Thomas had planted near the house. This was her sanctuary, the place where she had built a life with the man she loved, and where she intended to spend whatever years remained to her. The thought that anyone might challenge that simple dream never crossed her mind as she worked peacefully in her garden, unaware that distant riders had already spotted the thin column of smoke rising from her chimney. The riders appeared just after noon, 5 men on horseback moving with the easy confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Martha straightened from her garden work, shading her eyes against the sun as they approached. Rex stood beside her, his tail low and still, watching the strangers with what appeared to be nervous uncertainty. The lead rider was a large man with a thick beard and expensive boots, his gun belt worn low in the manner of someone who wanted it noticed. He dismounted with theatrical courtesy, removing his hat as he approached Martha's porch. His companions remained mounted, their eyes scanning the property with the calculating gaze of men appraising merchandise. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the bearded man said, his voice carrying a forced politeness that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Jake Donnelly. I'm afraid there's been some confusion about this here property." Martha wiped her hands on her apron, Rex pressing closer to her legs as the strangers closed in. "What kind of confusion?" she asked, though something in Donnelly's manner made her stomach tighten with unease. Donnelly reached into his vest and produced a folded document, his smile never wavering. "Seems this land was sold to pay off some debts your husband owed before he passed. Legal and proper, all signed and witnessed. I've got the papers right here." Martha's jaw set with quiet determination. "My husband never owed anyone money we couldn't pay. This ranch is mine, bought and paid for fair and square. I've got the deed to prove it." The smile on Donnelly's face flickered for just a moment before returning full force. "Well now, that's where things get complicated. See, sometimes folks get confused about paperwork, especially when they're grieving. Why don't you fetch that deed, and we can sort this whole thing out friendly-like." Rex shifted his weight slightly, his dark eyes tracking each of the mounted men as they spread out in a loose semicircle around the front of the house. To the casual observer, the old dog appeared nervous and overwhelmed, but something in his stillness suggested a different kind of alertness entirely. Martha disappeared into the house and returned moments later with a leather folder containing her deed. Donnelly examined it with exaggerated care, his men chuckling quietly among themselves as though sharing a private joke. After several minutes, he shook his head with mock regret. "I'm afraid this here document ain't worth the paper it's printed on," he said, tearing the deed cleanly in half. "The real papers show clear ownership transfer to me and my associates here. If you're enjoying this tale of courage and loyalty, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what country you're listening from." These stories of ordinary folks facing extraordinary challenges seem to resonate around the world, and I love seeing how far they travel. Now, let's see what happens when peaceful folks are pushed too far. Martha's face went white as she watched the pieces of her deed flutter to the ground. Rex's ears flattened against his head, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest as he sensed his mistress's distress. The mounted men laughed at the dog's display, seeing nothing more threatening than an old mutt trying to comfort his owner. "Now don't take on so, ma'am," Donnelly continued, his false courtesy evaporating like morning dew. "We're reasonable men. We'll give you till tomorrow morning to pack up whatever personal belongings you can carry and clear out peaceful-like." "This is my home," Martha said, her voice shaking with emotion rather than fear. "My husband and I built this life together. You can't just take it." Donnelly's expression hardened, and his men shifted in their saddles with predatory anticipation. "Actually, we can and we will. Question is whether you leave walking upright or get carried out. Your choice." One of the mounted men, a thin fellow with cruel eyes and a nervous laugh, spurred his horse forward to trample Martha's vegetable garden. The carefully tended plants disappeared under iron-shod hooves as he whooped with delight. Rex's growl deepened, his hackles rising as he watched the destruction, but the men paid him no attention beyond mocking laughter. "Look at that, boys," another rider called out as he knocked over Martha's water barrel with his boot. "Old dog's getting all worked up. Probably thinks he's protecting Grandma." Rex remained pressed against Martha's side, his body trembling with what the gang interpreted as fear, but might have been something else entirely. His dark eyes never left the intruders, tracking their movements with an intensity that seemed beyond the capabilities of an ordinary farm animal. As evening approached, Donnelly and his men made camp in Martha's own yard, building a fire from fence posts they had torn down and helping themselves to her chickens for their supper. They made no effort to hide their contempt for the elderly widow, speaking loudly about their plans as though she couldn't hear every word. "Tomorrow morning, we'll give the old lady one more chance," Donnelly told his companions as they passed around a bottle of whiskey. "If she's still being stubborn, well, accidents happen to folks living a lone way out here." Rex lay beside Martha on the porch steps, his ears constantly swiveling to catch every word the outlaws spoke. Something in his posture had changed since the confrontation began, a subtle shift that transformed nervous energy into coiled readiness. But in the flickering light of the campfire, the gang saw only what they expected to see: an aged dog keeping company with a frightened old woman who had nowhere else to turn. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Williams ranch, the cheerful birdsong of previous mornings replaced by an ominous silence. Martha had not slept, spending the night watching through her kitchen window as the gang took turns keeping guard around their campfire. Rex had remained alert beside her chair, his breathing steady but his ears constantly moving to track sounds beyond human perception. Donnelly emerged from his bedroll with the sun, stretching like a man without a care in the world. His companions stirred one by one, their laughter carrying across the yard as they discussed their plans for the day. Martha watched them wash in her own well water and help themselves to eggs from her chicken coop, treating her property as though it already belonged to them. "Time's up, old woman," Donnelly called out as he approached the house, his men spreading out behind him like wolves closing in on wounded prey. "Pack your things and get moving, or we'll do it for you." Martha stepped onto her porch, Rex close at her side, and faced the 5 armed men with dignity intact despite her fear. "This is still my home," she said quietly. "I'm not leaving." Donnelly's patient facade cracked completely. He strode forward and grabbed Martha's arm roughly, his fingers digging into the thin flesh above her elbow. His touch was deliberate and cruel, designed to cause pain and demonstrate his power over her frail body. The change in Rex was immediate and unmistakable. The low growl that rumbled from his chest carried a quality that made seasoned outlaws pause in their tracks. It was not the whimper of a frightened pet, but the warning of a predator announcing its presence. Rex's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that looked far too clean and sharp for a farm dog's diet of scraps and table food. "Well, would you look at that?" laughed the thin man who had destroyed Martha's garden the day before. "Old Mutt thinks he's going to protect Grandma from the big bad men." But something in Rex's stance had shifted. His weight balanced on all four paws in a way that suggested explosive movement rather than defensive posture. His dark eyes never left Donnelly's face, tracking every micro-expression with an intelligence that seemed beyond the capacity of an ordinary animal. Martha placed her free hand gently on Rex's head, her fingers moving in what appeared to be a comforting gesture, but might have been something else entirely. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her words carrying an undertone of command that made Rex's muscles relax slightly, while keeping him ready for action. Donnelly tightened his grip on Martha's arm until she gasped, his enjoyment of her pain evident in his crude smile. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners about respecting your betters," he said, raising his other hand as though to strike her. Rex's growl deepened to a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the porch. Every instinct in the outlaws' bodies told them to step back, though their minds could not process what they were sensing. This was not the growl of a house pet, but the voice of something that had been trained to kill on command. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the confrontation as Sheriff Bradley rode into the yard, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Martha felt a moment of hope until she saw the nervous way the lawman avoided eye contact and the careful distance he maintained from Donnelly's gang. "Morning, Jake," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who had already made his choice. "Everything going smooth out here?" Donnelly released Martha's arm, but remained close enough for his threat to linger in the air. "Smooth as silk, Sheriff. Just helping this poor confused widow understand her legal situation." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the torn deeds scattered around the porch steps, then to Martha's bruised arm, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Property disputes can be complicated," he said finally. "Best to work things out peaceful-like." Martha looked into the sheriff's eyes and saw her death warrant written there. He had been bought or intimidated into compliance, leaving her alone against 5 armed men who clearly had no intention of letting her live to tell anyone what had happened here. Rex sensed the change in the situation before anyone else. His ears swiveled to catch conversations the humans missed, and his nostrils flared to read scents that told stories of violence and corruption. When he looked at the sheriff, there was no confusion in those dark eyes about which side the man had chosen. "Well then," Sheriff Bradley said as he turned his horse to leave, "I guess everything's settled here. You folks have a good day now." As the lawman rode away without looking back, Donnelly's grin turned feral. "Now that was mighty considerate of the sheriff to stop by," he said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Saved us the trouble of wondering if anyone might come looking for you." His men laughed at the implied threat, their confidence growing as they realized no help would be coming for the isolated widow. Rex watched them all with eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness, every mistake, every opening that might present itself when the time came for action. The afternoon wore on with deliberate torment as the gang systematically destroyed everything Martha had worked to build. They scattered her chickens, dumped her grain stores, and used her furniture for target practice while she watched helplessly from the porch. Through it all, Rex remained pressed against her side, his apparent submission masking a readiness that none of the outlaws could perceive. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the yard, Donnelly gathered his men around their campfire to discuss their final plans. "Tomorrow at dawn, we finish this," he announced loud enough for Martha to hear every word. "Old lady's had her chance to leave peaceful. Now we do things the hard way." Rex's ears twitched at the words, and Martha's hand found the familiar spot behind his head where her husband used to scratch when giving him commands during their evening training sessions. The dog's entire body seemed to coil with anticipation as she whispered something too quiet for the outlaws to hear, words that sounded like comfort but carried the weight of military precision. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon as Donnelly kicked dirt over the dying embers of their campfire. His men stirred to life with the practiced efficiency of career criminals, checking their weapons and adjusting their gun belts for the work ahead. Martha watched from her kitchen window as they formed up in a loose line, their intentions written clearly in their cold smiles and casual brutality. "This is it, boys," Donnelly announced as he strapped on his second pistol. "Time to clear out the old bird and take what's rightfully ours. Remember, accidents happen to folks who resist too long." Rex lay beside Martha's chair, his breathing steady and controlled despite the tension radiating from every human in the vicinity. His dark eyes tracked each movement in the yard with mechanical precision, cataloging positions and weapons with the thoroughness of a military scout preparing for engagement. Martha's hand trembled slightly as she reached down to stroke Rex's head, her fingers finding the familiar pattern that Thomas had taught her years ago when the dog was young and eager to learn. She had never forgotten the commands her husband had drilled into both of them during those long evenings, when Rex was fresh from his military service and still sharp from combat training. The gang approached the house in formation, Donnelly in the center with two men flanking each side. Their boots thundered across the porch as they surrounded the front door, weapons drawn and ready for resistance that they assumed would never come. "Time's up, old woman," Donnelly shouted as he kicked open the door without bothering to knock. "Come out now, or we'll drag you out." Martha emerged from her kitchen slowly, Rex padding beside her with his head low and tail tucked as though cowering from the armed men. The outlaws laughed at the sight of the frightened dog pressing against his mistress, seeing nothing more threatening than a pet seeking comfort in familiar territory. "You've got one last chance," Donnelly said, his voice heavy with false patience. "Walk away now, and we'll let you live. Stay and fight, and you'll end up like every other fool who thought they could stand against us." Martha straightened her shoulders and looked directly into Donnelly's eyes with quiet determination. "This is my home," she said simply. "I'm not leaving." The outlaw leader's face darkened with rage. "Have it your way, then. Boys, tear this place apart and find whatever money she's got hidden. If she gets in the way, put her down." As the gang moved to spread through the house, Martha's hand found Rex's collar. Her fingers traced a specific pattern against the worn leather, a signal that had been practiced countless times in a different life under different circumstances. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had learned military commands from an expert. "Angriff," she said quietly, the German word cutting through the morning air like a blade. The transformation in Rex was instantaneous and terrifying. His cowering posture vanished as his spine straightened and his head came up with predatory alertness. The trembling stopped completely, replaced by the fluid readiness of a weapon that had just been armed and targeted. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that suddenly looked designed for killing, and his dark eyes fixed on the nearest outlaw with mechanical focus. The thin man who had destroyed Martha's garden found himself staring into the face of something that was no longer recognizably a farm dog. Rex's movement was explosive and precise, covering the distance between them in a single bound that brought 120 pounds of trained muscle into devastating contact with human flesh and bone. The outlaw's scream cut off abruptly as Rex's jaws locked around his gun arm with surgical precision. The man's pistol clattered to the floor as teeth designed for combat work found nerve clusters and pressure points with the accuracy of a field medic operating in reverse. Rex's attack was not the wild mauling of an angry animal, but the calculated assault of a weapon that had been trained to disable enemies efficiently and without waste. "What the hell?" Donnelly shouted as his man collapsed with his gun arm hanging useless at his side. "It's just a damn dog." But even as the words left his mouth, Donnelly could see that whatever had just attacked his companion was far more than just a dog. Rex moved with tactical awareness, positioning himself between Martha and the remaining threats while keeping his escape routes clear and his opponents off balance. The second outlaw tried to bring his rifle to bear on the animal, but Rex was already in motion. The dog's training had included combat against armed opponents, and he used the confined space of the house to his advantage. A quick feint to the left drew the man's aim off target, and Rex's charge from the right took him down at the knees with bone-crushing force. This time Rex's assault targeted the man's shooting hand with clinical precision. Teeth that had been trained to neutralize enemy soldiers found the exact pressure points needed to destroy fine motor control. The rifle fell from nerveless fingers as the outlaw collapsed, clutching his mangled hand, and screaming curses that devolved into pleas for mercy. Donnelly backpedaled toward the door, his confidence evaporating as he watched two of his men taken down by what he had dismissed as a harmless pet. "Kill it," he shouted to his remaining companions. "Kill the damn thing now." But Rex was no longer where their guns were aimed. Military training had taught him to use cover and concealment, to strike from unexpected angles and disappear before return fire could find him. He flowed through the house like liquid shadow, appearing just long enough to strike before melting back into positions that kept Martha safe while maintaining tactical advantage. "My God," Martha whispered as she watched Rex work. She had known he was trained, but seeing him in actual combat was like witnessing a master craftsman practicing his art. Every movement was economical and purposeful, every attack calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum exposure. As the third outlaw tried to flank around the kitchen table, Martha called out another command in the same crisp German that had triggered Rex's transformation. "Halt," she ordered, and Rex froze in position like a statue carved from black stone. The sudden stillness was somehow more unnerving than the violence had been. Rex stood perfectly motionless with his muscles coiled and ready, his dark eyes tracking targets while awaiting further orders. The remaining outlaws found themselves facing something that looked like a dog, but moved like a trained soldier. "Thomas taught us both," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the house. He was Sergeant Thomas Williams, 7th Cavalry, and Rex was his partner for 3 tours of duty on the frontier. They hunted Apache raiders together, tracked down deserters, and horse thieves. Rex has more confirmed kills than most gunfighters. Donnelly's face had gone pale as the implications hit him. This wasn't just some farm dog that had gotten lucky. This was a combat veteran with years of training and battlefield experience, a living weapon that had been disguised as a harmless pet. The 2 wounded outlaws moaned on the floor, their gun arms useless and their fighting spirit broken by the precision of Rex's attacks. They had faced armed men before and understood that kind of danger, but this was something beyond their experience or comprehension. "You boys picked the wrong widow to rob," Martha continued, her hand moving to Rex's head in a gesture that was both affection and control. "Rex here has been retired for 10 years, but some things you never forget. Isn't that right, boy?" Rex's tail moved in a single controlled wag, his eyes never leaving the remaining threats. He was waiting for orders, ready to continue the assault or stand down as his handler commanded. The choice belonged to Martha, and Donnelly was beginning to understand just how precarious his position had become. Donnelly's remaining men exchanged panicked glances as they backed toward the door, their swagger replaced by the kind of fear that comes from facing an enemy they don't understand. Rex stood motionless in the center of the room, his breathing steady and controlled while his dark eyes tracked every movement with predatory focus. The 2 wounded outlaws on the floor had stopped screaming, reduced to whimpering as they clutched their mangled arms and tried to crawl away from the animal that had destroyed them with surgical precision. "Get to the horses," Donnelly hissed to his companions, his voice cracking with strain. "We're getting out of here right now." But Rex had already anticipated their escape route. Years of frontier combat had taught him to think like his enemies, to predict their movements and cut off their options before they knew those options existed. As the outlaws made their desperate rush for the door, Rex flowed past them like black water, his movement so fluid and silent that they didn't realize he had flanked them until it was too late. The dog appeared in the doorway ahead of them, blocking their path to freedom with the calm certainty of a professional soldier who had chosen his ground. His lips were pulled back in what might have been a smile if dogs could truly smile, revealing teeth that caught the morning light like polished steel. The message was clear without words. No one was leaving until Martha Williams gave permission. The 4th outlaw, a heavy-set man with a nervous twitch who had been hanging back during the initial assault, tried to circle around through the kitchen. Rex's ears swiveled to track the movement without his head turning, a display of awareness that made it clear he was monitoring multiple threats simultaneously. When the man made his move, Rex was already waiting for him. The takedown was a masterpiece of tactical efficiency. Rex used the man's own momentum against him, appearing at ankle level to sweep his legs while simultaneously driving his shoulder into the outlaw's center of mass. The combined impact sent the man crashing into Martha's kitchen table with enough force to scatter dishes and leave him gasping for breath on the floor. Before the fallen outlaw could recover, Rex had pinned him with one massive paw pressed against his throat. The pressure was precisely calibrated, enough to prevent movement without crushing the windpipe, the kind of restraint that could only come from extensive training in prisoner control. The man's eyes bulged with terror as he stared up into Rex's face and saw his own death held in check by nothing more than the animal's professional discipline. "You're insane," the last standing gang member shouted as he pressed himself against the wall, his pistol trembling in his hands. "It's just a dog. We can kill it." Rex's head turned toward the speaker with mechanical precision, and the man found himself looking into eyes that held no trace of animal consciousness. What looked back at him was pure military intelligence, the cold assessment of a soldier who had killed before and would kill again if circumstances required it. The outlaw's gun hand began to shake so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on the weapon. Martha moved to the window and looked out at the horses tethered in her yard, their nervous stamping and head-tossing indicating they could smell the violence and fear that permeated the morning air. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had learned command presence from a career soldier. "Suchin," she ordered, and Rex immediately released his prisoner and moved to the window beside her. The German command triggered another phase of Rex's training. His entire posture shifted as he switched from combat mode to tracking mode, his head lowering and his nostrils flaring to read the scent trails that crisscrossed the property. Within seconds, he had cataloged every human who had been on the land in the past 24 hours, their emotional states, and their current positions. "He's reading the battlefield," Martha explained as the outlaws watched in horrified fascination. "Thomas taught him to track wounded enemies who might try to escape and regroup. Rex knows exactly where everyone is and what condition they're in." As if to demonstrate her words, Rex's ears suddenly perked toward the barn where the outlaws had stashed their extra ammunition and supplies. A low growl rumbled from his chest as he detected movement from that direction, someone trying to use the chaos as cover to reach the weapons cache. Donnelly cursed under his breath as he realized one of his wounded men had managed to crawl outside and was making his way toward their backup guns. The plan had been to overwhelm the old woman through superior firepower, but now their weapons were scattered and their men were being systematically hunted by something that moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Rex looked to Martha for orders, his entire body coiled with readiness to pursue the escaping threat. She considered for a moment, weighing mercy against necessity, before giving him a slight nod. The dog flowed out the door and across the yard with the silent efficiency of a shadow, his movements so fluid that he seemed to float above the ground rather than run across it. The wounded outlaw was halfway to the barn when Rex materialized behind him like a nightmare given form. The man never had a chance to scream before jaws designed for combat work found the pressure points in his neck and shoulders, delivering precisely controlled force that left him unconscious but breathing. Rex dragged his limp form back toward the house with the casual ease of a retriever bringing back a duck. Donnelly watched this display of tactical mastery with growing desperation. His gang had been reduced to helpless prisoners by a single animal that fought with the discipline and intelligence of an entire military unit. The careful planning and overwhelming force that had worked on dozens of previous victims meant nothing against an enemy that had been trained by the United States Army to hunt and kill professional soldiers. In a final act of desperation, Donnelly lunged toward Martha with his knife drawn, hoping to use her as a human shield against the animal that had destroyed his men. But Rex had been watching Donnelly with special attention, recognizing him as the pack leader whose elimination would end the threat permanently. The dog's interception was so fast that it seemed to violate the laws of physics. One moment Donnelly was reaching for Martha with his blade extended, and the next he was flat on his back with Rex's massive form pinning him to the floor. The knife had disappeared from his hand so quickly that he couldn't remember dropping it. Rex's jaws hovered inches from Donnelly's throat, close enough that the outlaw could feel the animal's breath and see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes. Death was right there, held back only by the training that required authorization before lethal force could be applied. Rex was waiting for Martha's command, ready to end the threat or spare the man's life as she directed. The choice belonged to the widow whose home had been violated and whose life had been threatened. Rex had given her the power of life and death over her enemies, and now he waited with perfect patience for her decision. Martha looked down at Jake Donnelly's terrified face, his eyes wide with the knowledge that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. Rex's massive form pressed him against the floorboards with implacable force, the dog's training allowing him to maintain perfect control while awaiting orders that would determine whether the outlaw lived or died. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the whimpering of wounded men and the distant sound of horses stamping nervously in the yard. "Enough," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had seen too much violence for one lifetime. "Let him live, but let him remember what happens to men who prey on the innocent." Rex held his position for 3 more seconds, long enough for Donnelly to understand that mercy was a gift rather than weakness, before stepping back with fluid grace. The outlaw scrambled away from the dog's reach, his face pale and his hands shaking as he struggled to comprehend how quickly his world had been turned upside down. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of legitimate law enforcement, Sheriff Bradley having been replaced by Deputy Marshal Carson and a posse of federal officers who had been tracking the Donnelly gang across 3 counties. The marshal surveyed the scene with professional appreciation, taking note of the efficiently disabled outlaws and the calm demeanor of both woman and dog. "Looks like you folks had some excitement here," Marshal Carson observed as his men began collecting the wounded gang members. "Mind telling me how 5 armed outlaws ended up in this condition?" Martha scratched behind Rex's ears, the simple gesture transforming him from deadly weapon back into devoted companion. "My dog doesn't care much for uninvited guests," she replied with understated dignity, "especially ones who threaten his family." The marshal studied Rex with the knowing eye of a man who had served in the cavalry himself. "That's no ordinary farm dog," he said with growing respect. "German shepherd, military bearing, probably frontier service, judging by the scars. What's his background?" Martha's eyes softened as she looked at her faithful protector. "Rex served 3 tours with the 7th Cavalry under Sergeant Thomas Williams, my late husband. Tracked Apache war parties, hunted deserters, protected supply convoys. He's got a Purple Heart and more confirmed kills than most gunfighters, but he's been retired for 10 years now." As the posse loaded the surviving gang members into their wagon, Deputy Marshal Carson approached Martha with genuine admiration. "Ma'am, I've been chasing the Donnelly gang for months. They've terrorized half a dozen communities and killed at least 8 people. You and your dog just did what an entire regiment couldn't manage." Rex had sustained minor injuries during the confrontation, a few scratches from broken furniture and a shallow cut on his shoulder where one outlaw's knife had found its mark. Martha tended to his wounds with the practiced efficiency of someone who had served as a field medic herself, her hands steady and sure as she cleaned and bandaged the cuts. "Easy, boy," she murmured as she worked. "Let me take care of you the way you took care of me." Her touch was gentle but professional, and Rex submitted to her ministrations with patient trust. As she worked, Martha found herself remembering the countless times she had performed the same service for Thomas when he returned from patrol with Rex at his side, both man and dog bearing the marks of another successful mission. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the kitchen windows when Martha finished her medical work. Rex's injuries were minor and would heal quickly, but the deeper wounds of memory had been reopened by the morning's violence. She could see it in his eyes, the weight of old battles and fallen comrades that no amount of retirement could completely erase. That evening, Martha sat in her kitchen reading from a worn leather journal that she kept locked in Thomas's desk. The pages contained Rex's complete service record, meticulously maintained by her husband throughout their years together. 3 tours of duty on the frontier, 47 confirmed engagements with hostile forces, 23 successful tracking missions, and 1 Purple Heart earned when he refused to abandon his wounded handler during an Apache ambush. The citation read like a military commendation for a human soldier. Rex had dragged Thomas to safety despite taking 2 arrows himself, then held their position against overwhelming odds until reinforcements arrived. The scars from that battle were still visible on Rex's flank, thin white lines that told the story of loyalty tested by fire and proven unbreakable. As darkness fell, Martha and Rex walked together to the small cemetery behind the house, where Thomas Williams lay buried beneath a simple headstone marked with his rank and years of service. Rex always grew quiet near the grave, his usual alertness softened by something that might have been grief or might simply have been the deep contentment of duty fulfilled. "We had visitors today, Thomas," Martha said as she knelt beside the headstone with Rex lying quietly at her side. "Rex took care of them the way you taught him. You'd have been proud of how he remembered his training." The wind through the cottonwood trees carried the peaceful sounds of evening, a stark contrast to the violence that had shattered the morning calm. Rex's ears twitched occasionally as he monitored the sounds around them, but his posture was relaxed in the way that only came when he was certain no threats remained in his territory. Martha's hand found the familiar spot behind Rex's ears, her fingers tracing the patterns that Thomas had taught her years ago when the dog was young and eager to learn. The commands for attack and pursuit, for tracking and restraint, for the delicate balance between protection and destruction that defined a warrior's life. "You're a good dog, Rex," she whispered as they sat together in the gathering darkness. "The best partner a person could ask for." Over the following weeks, word of the confrontation spread throughout the territory with the speed that only good stories achieve. The tale grew in the telling, as such stories do, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Martha Williams and her dog were not to be troubled by anyone with evil intentions. The respect shown by the community was genuine and lasting. Neighbors who had previously seen Martha as a vulnerable widow now recognized her as the keeper of a living legend. Children pointed with wide-eyed wonder at Rex during his walks through town, whispering stories of his military service and the morning he had single-handedly destroyed the notorious Donnelly gang. Rex seemed to understand his new status, but remained unchanged by it. He continued his daily routine of following Martha around the property, sleeping in his favorite spot beside the porch steps, and greeting visitors with the same calm assessment he had always shown. But now that assessment carried weight, and men with questionable intentions found other roads to travel, the ranch itself began to flourish in ways it never had before. With the threat of the Donnelly gang eliminated and Rex's reputation providing a protective shield, Martha found herself able to expand her operations. Neighboring ranchers sought her advice and offered their assistance, creating the kind of community support that made isolated frontier life not just bearable, but genuinely rewarding. On quiet evenings, Martha would sit in her rocking chair on the porch with Rex lying nearby, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the eternal vigilance of a sentry who had never learned to completely stand down. The scars from his wounds had healed cleanly, leaving only faint marks to remind them both of the morning when his past had collided with their present. Sometimes, when the light was just right and Rex's posture shifted in response to some distant sound, Martha could see the ghost of the young warrior he had once been. The dog who had charged through hostile territory with Thomas at his side, who had faced death without flinching and dealt it out with professional precision when duty demanded. That part of him would always be there, sleeping lightly beneath the surface of domestic tranquility. But there was another side to Rex that shone just as brightly, the gentle soul who had spent 10 years learning to be a companion rather than a weapon. He would never lose his edge entirely, but he had also never forgotten how to be simply and completely a dog who loved his human and wanted nothing more than to keep her safe. The balance between those two natures was perhaps the greatest gift Thomas had given them both. Rex could be a killing machine when circumstances required it, but he could also be a source of comfort and companionship when the world was peaceful. The training that had made him deadly had also given him the discipline to know when violence was appropriate and when it should be set aside in favor of gentler virtues. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, Martha found herself grateful for the strange path that had brought her to this place. The loss of Thomas would always be a wound in her heart, but Rex's presence made the burden bearable. Together, they had created something that neither could have achieved alone, a sanctuary where peace was protected by the promise of overwhelming force. If you enjoyed this tale of loyalty and courage in the face of overwhelming odds, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of ordinary folks who prove that heroism comes in many forms. We bring you tales of justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds between those who stand together against the darkness. Until next time, may you find the courage to protect what matters most, and may you never have to face that test alone. The last light of day painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson as Martha and Rex settled into their evening routine. The ranch was quiet now, protected by reputation as much as by the physical presence of its guardian. Rex dozed in his favorite spot beside Martha's chair, one eye always open and one ear always listening, ready to transform from companion to protector in the space between one heartbeat and the next. In the gathering darkness, the Williams Ranch stood as a testament to the power of loyalty and the price of peace. Some sanctuaries were protected by walls or weapons or the presence of many defenders. This one was guarded by an old woman and an older dog, and the certain knowledge that any threat to either would be met with the full weight of military precision and uncompromising devotion. The stars came out one by one above the quiet ranch, and Rex Williams settled more deeply into his peaceful sleep, dreaming perhaps of old battles won and new peace earned, secure in the knowledge that his watch would continue as long as breath remained in his body and love remained in his heart.